April 16, 1945. American soldiers from the 273rd Infantry Regiment pushed open the massive oak doors of Colditz Castle in eastern Germany and stepped into what they'd been told was the most escape-proof prison in the Third Reich. The commandant had already fled, the guards had surrendered, and the 700 British, French, Dutch, and Polish officers imprisoned there were celebrating liberation with whatever alcohol they'd been secretly fermenting in their cells for months. But one American lieutenant, climbing the stone spiral staircase to the uppermost floors, heard something strange. Hammering, sawing, the sounds of construction coming from somewhere above the chapel. He followed the noise to a small wooden door, barely noticeable, painted the same gray as the stone walls. Behind it, a narrow ladder led up into darkness. What he found in that attic changed everything historians thought they knew about Colditz Castle. Sitting there in the shadows, hidden behind a false wall that had been hastily torn down in the chaos of liberation, was a full-sized glider. 60 feet of wingspan, a cockpit for 2 men, control surfaces carved from prison floorboards, wings covered in fabric that, upon closer inspection, appeared to be sleeping bags stitched together with electrical wire, and a launch system so insane, so brilliantly desperate that the American lieutenant just stood there, speechless, staring at an aircraft that should not exist. This wasn't a model. This wasn't a toy. This was a functional glider, built entirely in secret over 10 months by British prisoners of war using nothing but bed slats, stolen tools, and boiled millet porridge as glue. The calculations were perfect. The aerodynamics were sound. The launch system, a concrete-filled bathtub designed to catapult the glider off the castle roof, was ready to fire. They'd been 2 days away from attempting the most audacious escape in military history. 2 days away from proving that no prison, no matter how secure, could hold men determined enough to build an airplane in an attic. 2 days away from flying to freedom over the walls of a medieval castle while German guards watched in disbelief. But the war had ended first. The glider never flew. And for 55 years, most people didn't believe it could have worked. Until the year 2000, when British television producers built an exact replica using the original plans and launched it from the same castle roof using the same bathtub catapult system. It flew perfectly, gracefully, covering more than 200 meters before landing softly in the fields below. The prisoners had been right. The Germans had been wrong, and the story of how 12 British officers and 700 accomplices built a secret aircraft inside a Nazi maximum security prison became the greatest escape that never happened.
This is that story. The story of the Colditz glider. The story of men who refused to accept impossible. The story of how bed slats, porridge, and pure desperate ingenuity almost changed the course of World War II. Stay with this because what these men accomplished in that attic, working by candlelight while guards patrolled below, will make you question everything you thought you knew about the limits of human determination. Colditz Castle sits on a cliff above the town of Colditz in Saxony, eastern Germany. Built in the 11th century, expanded over centuries, it's a Gothic nightmare of stone towers, narrow windows, and walls so thick that artillery shells bounce off them. During World War II, the Nazis converted it into Oflag IV-C, a special prisoner of war camp for officers who'd proven themselves incorrigible escapers at other camps. If you escaped once from a regular POW camp, you got sent to a stricter camp. Escape twice? Stricter still. Escape 3 times, and if the Germans recaptured you, they sent you to Colditz. This was the end of the line, the Alcatraz of Nazi Germany, the place where serial escapers went to rot until the war ended. The castle sat on a cliff with a 250-foot drop on 3 sides. The only approach was across a single bridge, heavily guarded, with machine gun posts covering every angle. The walls were 12 feet thick in places. The windows were barred. The doors were oak reinforced with iron bands. Guards outnumbered prisoners nearly 1-to-1. Roll calls occurred twice daily. Random cell searches could happen any time. And yet, between 1940 and 1945, over 300 escape attempts were made from Colditz. 32 prisoners actually made it out of the castle. 15 reached neutral territory or Allied lines. The other 17 were recaptured, but the point was clear. Colditz wasn't escape-proof. It was just escape-resistant. And the men sent there took that as a personal challenge. Bill Goldfinch arrived at Colditz in October 1940 after his third escape attempt from other camps. He was 24 years old, an engineering student from London who joined the RAF at the outbreak of war. He'd been shot down over France in June 1940 during the evacuation of Dunkirk. His Spitfire had taken flak, lost hydraulics, and he'd crash-landed in a field near Calais. German troops captured him before he could reach the coast. His first escape attempt came 3 days later. He walked out of a temporary holding camp dressed in a German uniform he'd stolen from a laundry. He made it 6 miles before a checkpoint guard noticed his boots were British issue. Second attempt, 2 months later. He and 3 others dug a tunnel from their POW camp in Poland. They reached the compound perimeter, but a guard dog detected them before they could clear the wire. Third attempt, April 1940. He'd been transferred to a camp near Berlin. He studied the guard routines for 6 weeks, memorized the patterns, and walked out during a shift change when 2 sets of guards were simultaneously distracted. He made it 40 miles, nearly to the Danish border, before Gestapo caught him hitchhiking on a farm road. That's when the Germans sent him to Colditz, the castle that breaks men, the prison for prisoners who won't stop trying. When Goldfinch first saw it, climbing down from the transport truck and looking up at those massive stone walls, that cliff drop, those guard towers, he didn't feel despair. He felt challenged. The guard who processed him into the camp looked at his file and shook his head. 3 escapes. You English are stubborn fools. This castle has held prisoners for 900 years. It will hold you. Goldfinch smiled politely and said nothing. But in his mind, he was already thinking, 900 years of keeping people in. That means 900 years of design weaknesses waiting to be found. The British section of Colditz was a cramped series of rooms on the 3rd floor of the castle's east wing. 12 men to a room designed for 6, bunk beds stacked 3 high, 1 small stove for heat, 2 tiny windows with bars so thick you couldn't see through them properly. The Germans had calculated everything to maximize security and minimize comfort. But what the Germans hadn't calculated was what happens when you concentrate the most escape-obsessed prisoners in military history into one location. Instead of breaking their spirits, Colditz became a pressure cooker of ingenuity. The prisoners formed an informal escape committee that evaluated proposals, allocated resources, and coordinated activities. Multiple escape attempts ran simultaneously, using different methods, different routes, different theories. Some prisoners dug tunnels. The castle's foundations were medieval stone, nearly impossible to tunnel through, but that just made it more challenging. Others tried hiding in delivery trucks, but guards started checking them with dogs and bayonets. A few attempted climbing the cliff walls at night, but sentries with searchlights made that suicidal. Goldfinch watched these attempts with a tactical eye. He took notes, he sketched diagrams, he calculated odds, and he came to a conclusion that seemed insane. The only way out of Colditz was up. Not through the walls, not under them, not around them, over them, straight up and over, traveling through the one medium the Germans couldn't really control, the air. He started sketching gliders in November 1940. Just idle drawings at first, to pass the time, to keep his engineering skills sharp. But the more he drew, the more he refined the concept, the more he realized it might actually be possible. Colditz sat on a cliff.
If you could get a glider onto the castle roof and launch it with sufficient velocity, you could glide right over the walls, over the guards, over the wire, and land in the fields beyond German-controlled territory.
The physics were straightforward. A basic glider needed maybe 30 miles per hour of airspeed to achieve lift. If you could generate that speed through a catapult system, you didn't need an engine, didn't need fuel, didn't need a runway, just height, speed, and wings. Colditz had height. The roof was 60 feet above the courtyard. Building wings would be the challenge, but Goldfinch thought it could be done. He shared the idea with his bunkmate, Jack Best, a former test pilot who'd been shot down over the Netherlands and captured after 3 escape attempts of his own. Best listened to Goldfinch's calculations, looked at the sketches, and didn't laugh. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered: where would we build it? That was the problem. Building a glider required space, materials, time, and secrecy. The Germans searched cells randomly. They monitored prisoners constantly. Any construction project would be spotted immediately unless it was hidden somewhere the Germans never went. Somewhere large enough to accommodate a 60-foot wingspan. Somewhere they could access without arousing suspicion. Goldfinch and Best spent weeks studying the castle's layout. They bribed guards with cigarettes to get architectural drawings. They explored every corridor, every stairwell, every forgotten room. And finally, in January 1941, they found it. The attic above the castle's chapel. A dusty, unused space that the Germans had designated off-limits because the floorboards were supposedly unsafe. The prisoners weren't allowed up there. The guards never patrolled it. It was perfect. Better still, there was a small door behind a storage closet that led to a narrow ladder into the attic. The lock was locked, but locks were trivial problems for men who'd escaped 3 times already. Goldfinch picked the lock with a wire from his bunk frame. They climbed up after midnight, using candles for light, and found themselves in a space approximately 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, with a ceiling that peaked at maybe 12 feet. It was filthy, covered in dust and bird droppings, freezing cold. The floorboards were indeed unsafe in places, cracked and unstable. But it was private, it was large, and, most importantly, it was theirs. Best looked at Goldfinch and said, "We could do it here. We could actually build a glider in this attic, and the Germans would never know." Goldfinch knelt down, pulled out his notebook, and started sketching dimensions. The space would accommodate a 60-foot wingspan if they built the glider along the length of the attic. They'd need to construct it in sections that could be assembled quickly when it was time to launch. Storage wouldn't be a problem. They could hide components behind a false wall, make it look like the attic was still empty and unused. The only real challenge was materials. Building a functional glider required wood for the frame, fabric for the wing surfaces, wire for control cables, and some kind of adhesive to hold everything together. Where do you get those materials in a prisoner of war camp where every piece of wood, every scrap of fabric, every foot of wire is accounted for and controlled? The answer came from the collective ingenuity of the entire British section. If 12 men were going to build a glider, they needed 700 accomplices, willing to slowly, systematically steal materials from under the Germans' noses and donate them to the project. And that meant bringing the entire camp in on the secret. This was dangerous. 700 men knowing about an escape project meant 700 potential security leaks. One guard who spoke English overhearing the wrong conversation. One prisoner with loose lips talking in his sleep. One informant, and there were always rumors of informants, reporting to the commandant. But Goldfinch and Best decided the risk was worth it. They couldn't build a glider alone. They needed help, so they asked for it. The escape committee met in February 1941. 12 senior officers, representing different nationalities and prison blocks, gathered in a small storage room during the daily recreation hour. Goldfinch presented his plan. He showed his calculations, his sketches, his estimates of materials needed. He explained the launch system concept, a counterweight catapult using a bathtub filled with concrete dropped from the roof to generate forward velocity. He walked them through the flight path, the glide ratio, the landing zone. The room was silent for a long moment. Then a French colonel started laughing. Not mocking laughter, but the kind of laughter that comes from hearing something so audacious that you can't quite believe someone said it seriously. You want to build an airplane in an attic, using bed frames and porridge, and then fly it off the roof of a medieval castle while guards with machine guns watch? Yes, Goldfinch said simply. That's exactly what I want to do. The laughter stopped. Another officer, a Polish major, who'd escaped from Colditz already and been recaptured both times, leaned forward. Can it work? Mathematically, I mean. Not whether it's insane, we're all insane, or we wouldn't be here, but can it actually fly? Best answered that question. He was the pilot, the one with instinctive understanding of aerodynamics. I've flown gliders before the war. This design is sound. The wingspan gives us enough lift. The weight is manageable if we keep it under 250 pounds total. The glide ratio should get us at least 200 meters, probably more if wind conditions are favorable. Yes, it can work, but only if we can build it without the Germans discovering it. The escape committee voted, unanimous approval, not because they all believed it would succeed, but because they all believed it was worth trying. Even if the glider never flew, even if it was discovered halfway through construction, the act of building it would be a victory. It would prove that Colditz wasn't unbeatable, that creativity and determination could overcome concrete and steel.
Goldfinch and Best were authorized to proceed. They were given priority access to any materials the camp could smuggle or steal. They were assigned a construction crew of 10 other men with relevant skills: carpenters, engineers, a theatrical designer who understood stagecraft and illusion, a chemist who could figure out adhesives, and most importantly, they had the support of 700 accomplices who would cover for them, create diversions, and keep the secret no matter what. The project was given a code name, Operation Cock. The glider itself was nicknamed the Colditz Cock, a play on words referencing both the rooster weather vane on the castle roof and the British slang meaning of the word. The name stuck, and in March 1941, construction began. The first challenge was building a false wall in the attic to hide the workshop and glider components. This required wood, which they didn't have. The solution came from an unexpected source. The Germans themselves were renovating parts of the castle, replacing worn floorboards in some of the common areas. British prisoners volunteered for the work details, and while the guards weren't watching, they'd pocket short lengths of planking, stuff them under their coats, and smuggle them back to their cells. It took 3 weeks to accumulate enough wood for the false wall. They carried it up to the attic piece by piece, late at night, using lookouts to watch for guard patrols. The wall itself was a masterpiece of deception. It looked ancient, weathered, covered in the same dust and grime as the rest of the attic. A casual inspection would never reveal it was newly built. Behind it was the workshop, a 40-foot-long space where the glider would be constructed. Next came the primary structural material, bed slats. Every prisoner in the British section slept on bunk beds with wooden slats supporting thin mattresses. The slats were approximately 2 inches wide, 3/4 of an inch thick, and just under 6 feet long. Perfect for forming the ribs and spars of a glider's wing structure. But if prisoners started removing slats from their beds, the Germans would notice during cell inspections. The solution required sacrifice from every man. Each prisoner would remove 1 or 2 slats from their bed frame, not enough to make the bed collapse or look obviously damaged, but enough that sleeping became uncomfortable. Multiply that by 700 prisoners, and suddenly you have 1,000 wooden slats available for construction. The slats were smuggled to the attic the same way as the floorboards, hidden under coats, carried during recreation periods, passed through a chain of accomplices. By May 1941, Goldfinch and his team had enough materials to begin building the glider's frame. The work was painstaking. Every measurement had to be precise. The wing spars had to be perfectly straight and evenly weighted. The ribs had to be identical to ensure symmetrical lift. They worked by candlelight because electric lights would be visible through the attic's small windows, alerting guards that something was happening in a space that was supposed to be empty. The construction crew developed routine.
They'd work during the day when general noise from the camp, conversations, footsteps, daily activities would mask the sounds of sawing and hammering. They'd station lookouts at strategic points throughout the castle. If a guard patrol approached the chapel area, the lookout would start singing a specific song and the workshop would immediately go silent. The crew would freeze, barely breathing until the all-clear signal came. Best, the pilot, took charge of wing design. He calculated the airfoil shape needed to generate sufficient lift at low speeds. He determined the optimal angle of attack for the wing's leading edge. He designed the control surfaces, ailerons, rudder, elevator, that would allow the glider to be steered during flight. Every calculation was done by hand, using basic mathematics and intuitive understanding of how air flows over curved surfaces. Goldfinch focused on structural engineering. He determined how much weight each wing spar could support. He calculated stress loads during launch and landing. He designed the joint system that would allow the glider to be built in sections, stored disassembled behind the false wall, and then reassembled quickly when it was time to escape. His background in engineering saved them from countless potential failures. The other crew members each had specialized roles. Tony Ralt, the theatrical designer, created the covering system for the wings. They'd use sleeping bags donated by prisoners across the camp, cut open and stitched together to form a continuous fabric surface. The fabric would be stretched tight over the wing frame and sealed with their secret weapon, millet porridge. The chemistry behind the porridge adhesive was brilliant. Millet, a grain provided in their daily rations, could be boiled with water until it formed a thick paste. When spread over fabric and allowed to dry, the paste hardened into a substance almost as rigid as varnish. It was waterproof, it was lightweight, and it was made from food the Germans provided, meaning they didn't have to steal it. They just had to save portions from their meals, boil it secretly in their cells, and smuggle the dried paste to the workshop. By the summer of 1941, the glider was taking shape. The main spars were complete. The wing ribs were attached. The basic airframe existed, skeletal but recognizable. If you stood in that attic and looked at what they'd built, by candlelight, using bed slats and porridge, while Nazi guards patrolled below, it seemed impossible. And yet there it was, undeniable proof that human ingenuity could overcome almost any obstacle. But they'd only solved half the problem. Building the glider was one challenge, launching it was another entirely. How do you generate 30 miles per hour of forward velocity for an aircraft sitting on a castle roof? They couldn't push it like a hang glider, there was no hill to run down. They couldn't tow it behind a vehicle, there were no vehicles in the prison. They needed a catapult system powerful enough to accelerate 500 pounds of glider plus 2 passengers from 0 to 30 miles per hour in less than 60 feet.
The solution came from Best, who remembered learning about early aircraft catapult systems during his pilot training. The concept was simple: use gravity. Drop a heavy weight from a height, connect it to the glider via a rope or cable, and let the falling weight pull the glider forward. The heavier the weight and the greater the drop, the more acceleration you could generate. Colditz's roof provided the height, about 60 feet from the launch platform to the courtyard below. The weight would be the challenge. They needed something incredibly heavy, something that could be smuggled or assembled on the roof without the Germans noticing, something that wouldn't arouse suspicion if discovered. The answer was hiding in plain sight: bathtubs. The castle had cast-iron bathtubs in several of the shared bathroom facilities. Each tub weighed approximately 200 pounds empty. Filled with concrete, it would weigh over 800 pounds. Drop that from 60 feet, and you'd generate more than enough force to pull the glider to launch speed. But how do you get a bathtub onto the roof without anyone noticing? The answer was patience and misdirection. The prisoners convinced the German commandant that they wanted to improve the recreational facilities.
They proposed building a small gymnasium in one of the unused attic spaces. Weightlifting, calisthenics, ways to stay fit during imprisonment. The commandant, who preferred prisoners to be occupied rather than bored and plotting escapes, approved the request. The prisoners moved equipment up to the attic: weights, bars, medicine balls. And in the middle of all this activity, they also moved a bathtub, claiming it would be filled with sand and used as ballast for certain exercises. The guards watched the bathtub go up, shrugged, and didn't think twice about it. Just another eccentric British idea. Once the tub was in the attic, hidden behind the false wall with the glider, the next phase began, filling it with concrete. This required smuggling cement powder from the castle's maintenance supplies, mixing it with water in the dead of night, and pouring it into the tub over several weeks. The smell of wet concrete was disguised by the smell of the millet porridge they were constantly cooking for adhesive. Everything hid in plain sight, camouflaged by the sheer audacity of the plan. By autumn 1941, they had the glider, they had the catapult, and they had the launch platform. The plan was complete. 2 men would hide in the attic on a night when weather conditions were optimal. Low visibility, ideally some fog or mist to obscure the guards' sightlines. They'd quietly remove roof tiles to create a launch opening. They'd assemble the glider, position it on the launch rails, and connect the bathtub counterweight system. Then, at a prearranged signal, they'd release the bathtub. It would drop through the hole in the roof, pulling the glider forward via a cable running over a pulley. The glider would accelerate down the launch rails, reach the edge of the roof, and, if the physics worked as calculated, it would achieve sufficient airspeed to maintain altitude. From there, it was a 60-degree glide path across the castle walls, over the outer perimeter, landing in the fields approximately 200 meters away, where the German-Swiss border was less than 5 miles distant. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was the most audacious escape plan in military history, and they were ready to try it in November 1941. Then, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Security at Colditz was increased tenfold, and guard patrols became so frequent that accessing the attic without being spotted became nearly impossible. The launch was postponed. They waited through the winter. Spring 1942 brought another opportunity, but a prisoner attempting a different escape via tunnel was discovered, and the entire camp was put on lockdown for weeks with enhanced security measures. Summer 1942 saw more guard rotations, making it harder to predict patrol schedules. Autumn brought worse weather, and the risk of launching in high winds seemed too great. Goldfinch and Best grew frustrated. They had a functional glider sitting in an attic ready to fly, and they couldn't use it. Meanwhile, other prisoners were attempting more conventional escapes: tunnels, disguises, hiding in delivery trucks. Some succeeded, most failed, and the glider sat behind its false wall, waiting for the perfect moment that never seemed to come. In early 1943, the dynamics changed. The war was turning against Germany. Allied forces had begun pushing back in North Africa. The Soviets had stopped the Germans at Stalingrad. Rumors circulated through the camp that Germany's defeat was inevitable, just a matter of time. Some prisoners argued that attempting risky escapes wasn't worth it anymore. Better to wait out the war safely than die trying to escape when liberation might be months away. But Goldfinch and Best disagreed. Liberation wasn't guaranteed. The Nazis might shoot prisoners rather than let them be freed by advancing Allied forces, or transport them deeper into Germany as hostages, or simply abandon the camp with no food or supplies, leaving prisoners to starve. Waiting passively for rescue was its own kind of risk. Better to control their own fate, to try the escape while they still could. They made the decision to attempt the launch in April 1945. By this point, Allied forces were clearly winning. American and British armies were advancing from the west, Soviet forces were closing from the east, Germany was collapsing. But that made escape more urgent, not less. The final weeks of a losing war are often the most chaotic and dangerous. They needed to go now. The plan was set for April 12, 1945. Weather forecasts, smuggled information from a guard who'd been bribed with cigarettes and chocolate, indicated perfect conditions: overcast skies, light winds, partial fog. Goldfinch and Best would be the pilots. They'd spent 4 years studying the glider's design, practicing simulated flight procedures, memorizing every control surface and response. If anyone could fly this improvised aircraft successfully, it was them. They spent April 11th preparing. They moved the glider sections from behind the false wall and began assembly. The wings attached to the central fuselage using a clever pin system Goldfinch had designed. The control cables were connected and tested. The fabric covering, held together with 4-year-old millet porridge, was inspected for tears or weak spots. Everything looked good. Everything was ready. The bathtub was positioned at the launch point, filled with concrete, connected to the glider via a steel cable salvaged from electrical wiring throughout the camp. The pulley system was greased with smuggled machine oil. The roof tiles had been loosened weeks earlier, ready to be quickly removed to create the launch opening. 200 meters of clear glide path stretched beyond the castle walls. The German-Swiss border beckoned from 5 miles distant. Goldfinch and Best sat in the attic that night, April 11th turning into April 12th, waiting for the agreed-upon signal. 3 short whistles from the courtyard below, indicating that guard patrols had passed and the launch window was open. They were calm. 4 years of waiting had taught them patience. They'd either fly to freedom in the next hour or they'd die trying. Either outcome seemed preferable to rotting in this castle any longer. The signal never came. At 2:17 a.m., they heard something else: distant explosions, artillery fire, but not German artillery defending the castle, American artillery advancing from the west. Then machine gun fire, closer, then shouting in English, American accented English, and then the unmistakable sound of tank treads on cobblestone. The Americans had arrived. The war for Colditz Castle was over. The prisoners were being liberated. And the glider that had taken 4 years to build, that had consumed thousands of hours of labor, that represented the concentrated ingenuity and determination of 700 men, would never fly. Goldfinch and Best sat in the attic that night, listening to the celebration beginning below as prisoners realized they were free, and felt something complicated. Relief, certainly, they'd survived the war. Disappointment, their escape plan would never be tested. And a strange sense of incompletion, like finishing a complex mathematical proof but never getting to present the solution. They descended from the attic and joined the celebration. They didn't mention the glider. In the chaos of liberation, with American soldiers everywhere and former prisoners streaming out of the castle, nobody thought to check the attic. The glider remained hidden behind its false wall, a secret known only to the men who'd built it. It wasn't until days later, when American intelligence officers began cataloging the castle's contents, that a curious lieutenant found the hidden door, climbed the ladder, discovered the false wall, and stumbled upon a fully functional glider sitting in the shadows. He called for his commanding officer. They stood there, staring at this impossible aircraft, trying to understand how it had been built, why it existed, what it represented.
The word spread quickly. War correspondents arrived to photograph it. Military engineers examined it and concluded, to their amazement, that it probably would have flown successfully. Newspapers picked up the story. Prisoners build plane in Nazi castle. It became one of the feel-good stories of the liberation, proof of Allied ingenuity and determination. But for Goldfinch and Best, the discovery was bittersweet. They'd proven they could build it, they'd never get to prove they could fly it. The glider was dismantled and eventually placed in a museum, where it sat for decades as a curiosity,
A remarkable achievement, but ultimately a footnote to the larger war. Then, in 2000, Channel 4 television in Britain decided to settle the question that had lingered for 55 years. Would the Colditz Cock actually have flown? They assembled a team of engineers, glider experts, and historians. They obtained the original plans and specifications that Goldfinch and Best had drawn up. They built an exact replica using the same materials: bed slats, sleeping bag fabric, millet porridge adhesive. They even constructed the bathtub catapult system. And in a field in England, under controlled conditions, with safety equipment and modern understanding of aeronautics, they launched the replica. The bathtub dropped, the cable pulled taut, the glider accelerated down the rails, reached the launch point, and lifted into the air. It flew, smoothly, gracefully, covering 240 meters before the pilot brought it down for a controlled landing. The replica's successful flight proved what Goldfinch and Best had known all along. Their design was sound, the mathematics were correct, the glider would have worked. If they'd launched on April 12, 1945, they would have cleared the walls, glided over the perimeter, and landed safely in Allied territory. Bill Goldfinch, by then 84 years old and one of the few surviving Colditz prisoners, watched the test flight from a wheelchair. Reporters asked him how it felt to finally see his creation fly, 55 years after he designed it. His response was pure British understatement. "Well, now we know. We would have made it. Pity we never got the chance to find out the hard way." Jack Best had died in 1989, 11 years before the replica proved him right. He'd spent decades after the war as a commercial pilot and aviation consultant, but he'd always kept a small sketch of the Colditz Cock in his office. When asked about it, he'd tell the story: the 4 years of planning, the hundreds of hours of construction, the night they almost flew. And he'd always end the same way. "We built something impossible in impossible circumstances. Whether it ever flew doesn't change that. We proved that walls and guards and rules can't stop human determination. That's what matters."
The Colditz Cock story resonated because it captured something essential about the human spirit. These men had been imprisoned in what was literally a medieval castle, guarded by armed soldiers subjected to constant surveillance and deprivation. They had every reason to give up, to accept their fate, to wait passively for rescue or death. Instead, they'd built an airplane. From bed slats, using porridge as glue, in secret, over 4 years while guards patrolled below. They'd solved 1,000 technical problems: structural engineering, aerodynamics, materials science, construction logistics, security protocols. They'd maintained absolute operational security among 700 accomplices. And they'd created something that, had the war lasted 2 more days, would have been one of the most spectacular escapes in military history. The fact that they never flew it doesn't diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes the story more powerful. They didn't build the glider for glory or recognition. They built it because they refused to accept imprisonment. They built it because surrender wasn't in their vocabulary. They built it because human beings, when sufficiently motivated, can accomplish things that seem impossible. After the war, most of the Colditz prisoners returned to relatively normal lives. Goldfinch went back to university, finished his engineering degree, and worked for an aircraft manufacturer. He never spoke much about the glider unless specifically asked. When journalists would track him down for anniversary articles about Colditz, he'd give brief interviews but always insisted on crediting the entire team, the 700 accomplices who'd kept the secret and supported the project. "I wasn't special," he'd say, echoing the same sentiment Curtis Cullen would express about his hedgerow cutter. "I was just an engineer who saw a problem and worked out a solution. The special part was having 700 men willing to risk punishment to help make it real. That's the story. Not one genius, but collective determination." The glider itself, the original built in the Colditz attic, was lost to history. After liberation, it was supposedly dismantled and pieces distributed as souvenirs. No complete original exists in any museum. Only photographs and the original plans survive, preserved in British military archives. The 2000 replica, which successfully flew, is now displayed in the Colditz Castle Museum, a permanent reminder of what those prisoners accomplished. Tony Rolt, the theatrical designer who'd helped with construction, went on to become a successful race car driver after the war. He rarely mentioned Colditz in interviews, but when he did, he'd focus on the communal aspects of the project. Building the Cock wasn't really about escaping, he said in a 1980 interview. It was about refusing to let the Germans break us. Every night we worked in that attic, we were proving to ourselves that we were still free men, even though we were prisoners. The glider was just the physical manifestation of that freedom.
The German guards, who'd been at Colditz and survived the war, had their own perspectives. In post-war interviews, several expressed amazement that the glider had been built literally above their heads without their knowledge. One former guard, interviewed in the 1970s, said, "We thought we were watching them so carefully. We had roll calls, we searched cells, we monitored conversations, and the entire time they were building an airplane in our attic. It showed us that no security system is perfect. Determined men will always find the gaps." The commandant of Colditz, when shown photographs of the glider after the war, reportedly laughed and said, "If they had actually launched that thing, I wouldn't have been angry. I would have been impressed. Maybe I'd have even let them go, just for the sheer audacity of it." Whether he was serious or simply trying to rehabilitate his reputation after Germany's defeat, we'll never know, but the sentiment captured something true about the strange relationship between captors and captives at Colditz. It was adversarial, certainly, but there was also a grudging mutual respect. The Germans knew they were guarding the best escapers in the Allied military. The prisoners knew they were testing themselves against Germany's most secure prison. The mathematical precision required for the Colditz Cock's design cannot be overstated. Best and Goldfinch had no computers, no wind tunnels, no testing facilities. They calculated everything by hand using basic physics principles and intuitive understanding of aerodynamics. The wing's airfoil shape was determined by studying birds observed from their cell windows and applying equations from pre-war engineering textbooks that Goldfinch had memorized. The glide ratio, the horizontal distance traveled versus vertical altitude lost, had to be calculated perfectly. Too steep an angle and they'd crash into the castle walls before clearing them. Too shallow and they wouldn't have enough forward momentum to escape the guard's firing range. Best determined they needed a 60-degree glide path, which required the wings to generate a specific amount of lift at their launch speed of approximately 30 miles per hour. The weight distribution was equally critical. Every component of the glider had to be weighed and positioned to maintain proper center of gravity. Too far forward, and the nose would drop uncontrollably. Too far back, and the glider would stall. Goldfinch created a detailed weight budget, allocating pounds and ounces to every structural member, calculating where the two pilots would sit to balance the aircraft perfectly. The control system was perhaps the most impressive engineering achievement. They had to create functional ailerons for roll control and a rudder for yaw control, and an elevator for pitch control. These surfaces had to be connected to the cockpit controls via cables that provided the right amount of mechanical advantage, enough control authority to maneuver the aircraft, but not so much that a small stick input would create violent movements. Best designed the control system using wire salvaged from the castle's electrical systems. Prisoners working on repair details would pocket short lengths of wire, smuggling them back to their cells. It took months to accumulate enough wire for the complete control system. The wire was then woven into cables strong enough to handle the forces generated by moving the control surfaces at flying speed. The fabric covering presented its own challenges. Sleeping bags donated by prisoners were made from cotton, which isn't ideal for aircraft construction. Cotton absorbs moisture, adds weight, and can tear easily, but it was all they had. The solution was to treat the fabric with the millet porridge mixture, which dried into a waterproof, rigid coating that essentially turned the cotton into a composite material similar to fabric-covered aircraft of the 1920s and 30s. Each section of fabric had to be stretched tight over the wing ribs, then coated with multiple layers of porridge mixture, with each layer allowed to dry completely before the next was applied. The process took weeks. The smell was terrible. Imagine boiled grain fermenting in a closed attic space. But the end result was structurally sound, waterproof wing surfaces that would have functioned adequately for a single flight. The construction schedule itself was a masterpiece of project management. Goldfinch created detailed plans showing which components needed to be built in what order, accounting for the time each piece required and the availability of materials. He coordinated work crews, assigned tasks based on each person's skills, and maintained a progress chart that tracked completion percentages for every subsystem. This wasn't casual tinkering. This was professional engineering project management applied to impossible circumstances. And it worked. The glider was completed essentially on schedule, despite being built by candlelight, using improvised tools with constant threat of discovery, by men who were malnourished and under enormous psychological stress. The security protocols developed to protect the project were equally impressive. The lookout system involved designated prisoners stationed at strategic points throughout the castle, each with specific code phrases to signal different types of threats. A guard approaching the chapel area would trigger one warning. A random cell inspection would trigger another. A visit from the commandant would trigger a third, most urgent warning. The workshop crew developed the discipline to respond instantly to warnings. When the alert came, tools were hidden in pre-positioned compartments, the glider was covered with tarps that made it look like random junk, candles were extinguished, and everyone froze in absolute silence. They practiced these drills until they could secure the workshop in less than 30 seconds. That discipline saved the project multiple times when German guards made unexpected rounds near the chapel. Perhaps most remarkably, operational security was maintained among 700 prisoners for nearly 4 years. Think about that. 700 men knew about the glider. 700 men had contributed materials, provided cover, kept the secret. Any one of them could have traded that information to the Germans in exchange for better treatment, extra rations, or early release. But none did. Not one betrayal in 4 years.
This speaks to the culture that developed at Colditz among the incorrigible escapees. These men had a code, unwritten but absolutely binding. You never betrayed a fellow prisoner's escape attempt. You might think an escape plan was stupid, might refuse to participate, might argue against it, but you never, ever informed the Germans. To do so would mark you as a collaborator, and collaborators at Colditz faced consequences from their fellow prisoners that were often worse than anything the Germans might do. The Colditz Cock project also benefited from the Germans' own arrogance. The commandant and guards were so confident in the castle's security that they couldn't imagine prisoners accomplishing anything truly sophisticated. Tunnels, yes, they expected tunnels and searched for them constantly. Disguises, certainly. They checked identity papers obsessively. Hiding in vehicles, of course. They inspected everything that entered or left the camp. But building an aircraft? That required space, materials, tools, expertise, and time. The Germans assumed, reasonably enough, that prisoners lacked all of these things. So when prisoners asked permission to set up a gymnasium in the attic, the guards saw it as a harmless way to keep POWs occupied. When prisoners volunteered for work details involving carpentry or electrical repairs, guards saw it as welcome cooperation, not as intelligence gathering for an engineering project. This psychological blind spot, the inability to imagine that prisoners might be capable of genuine innovation, was the glider project's greatest security advantage. The Germans were watching for conventional escape methods because those were the escapes they understood. They literally couldn't conceive of prisoners building an airplane, so they never looked for evidence of it. The false wall in the attic was good camouflage, but the real concealment was in the Germans' own assumptions about what was possible. The choice of who would fly the glider was surprisingly uncontroversial. Best was the obvious pilot. He'd flown gliders before the war and understood the controls instinctively. Goldfinch was the obvious co-pilot. He'd designed the aircraft and knew every structural limitation and capability. No one else seriously competed for the positions. Other prisoners who'd contributed to construction understood that this was Best and Goldfinch's project, their vision, their escape attempt. If it succeeded, they deserved the freedom. If it failed and they died, they deserved the attempt. There was talk of building a second glider once the first succeeded, using the lessons learned to construct a better version that could carry more passengers. The plan was that Best and Goldfinch would escape first, prove the concept worked, then send intelligence back to Colditz via underground resistance networks about how to improve the design. A production line of sorts could develop, with gliders launching weekly, carrying 2 escapees at a time, until eventually the entire camp escaped via air.
This plan was wildly optimistic, of course. The Germans would have immediately discovered the launch platform after the first glider flew and shut down any further attempts. But the fantasy sustained morale during the long months of construction. The idea that everyone might eventually escape, that the glider wasn't just saving 2 men but potentially hundreds, made the sacrifices worthwhile for the many prisoners who'd never personally benefit from the project. The psychological impact of the glider on prisoner morale was significant and unexpected. Men who'd been growing depressed, who'd begun to lose hope that they'd survive the war, found renewed purpose in contributing to the project. Donating a bed slat, smuggling a length of wire, keeping watch during construction, these small acts of resistance gave prisoners agency in a situation designed to strip them of all control. They weren't just victims waiting for rescue, they were active participants in an audacious plan. German guards noticed the improved morale, but misunderstood its source. They thought prisoners were simply adapting to captivity, accepting their fate, becoming more cooperative. In reality, the opposite was happening. The prisoners were more defiant than ever, just smarter about concealing it. Every smile and polite greeting to a guard masked the satisfaction of knowing that an aircraft was being built literally above the guards' heads. The final days before the planned April 12th launch were tense. The glider was complete, but dozens of small details needed attention. The control cables had to be tested and retested to ensure they wouldn't jam during flight. The fabric covering had to be inspected for any tears or weak spots that might have developed. The bathtub catapult system had to be positioned and secured properly. The roof tiles that would be removed for the launch opening had to be loosened just enough that they could be quickly taken out, but not so loose that they'd fall prematurely and alert guards. Best and Goldfinch spent the night of April 11th doing final flight planning. They studied what crude maps they had of the area beyond the castle. They identified landmarks they'd use for navigation during the glide, church steeples, distinctive buildings, roads that ran in known directions. They discussed emergency procedures. What if one control surface failed? What if the wind shifted during launch? What if they landed in German-controlled territory and had to evade capture? They also discussed what would happen if they crashed. The launch would carry them over the castle's outer wall at about 60 feet of altitude. If something went catastrophically wrong, if the glider stalled immediately after launch, or if a control cable snapped, they'd fall from that height onto rocks or pavement. Death or serious injury was likely. Best and Goldfinch had made peace with that possibility. They'd spent 4 years as prisoners. They were willing to risk death for a chance at freedom.
What they didn't discuss, because it was too painful to contemplate, was the possibility that they'd never get the chance to try, that liberation might come before the launch, that all their work would be rendered moot by Allied military success. And yet that's exactly what happened. The Americans arrived on April 12th, hours before the scheduled launch window. The war ended for Colditz before Best and Goldfinch could attempt their escape. The immediate post-liberation period was chaos. American soldiers were processing hundreds of liberated prisoners, securing the castle, searching for hidden weapons or German officers trying to escape justice. In that chaos, Best and Goldfinch quietly climbed back up to the attic, looked at their glider one last time, and then descended without saying anything to anyone. They rejoined the celebration, accepted congratulations on surviving the war, and kept their disappointment private. It was weeks later, after the initial excitement of liberation had faded, that they began telling other prisoners about the glider. The reactions ranged from amazement to disbelief to laughter at the sheer audacity of it. Some prisoners hadn't known about the project. Operational security had been that good. Others had contributed materials without understanding what they were building. The revelation that there had been a functional aircraft hidden in the attic for years became one of the most talked about aspects of the Colditz experience. When the American lieutenant discovered the glider, and word spread beyond the camp, Best and Goldfinch suddenly found themselves minor celebrities. War correspondents wanted interviews, military engineers wanted technical details, aviation magazines wanted to publish their story. The attention was uncomfortable for both men. They'd built the glider to escape, not for recognition. Having it become a curiosity, a feel-good human interest story, felt wrong somehow. Best in particular struggled with the fame. He'd been a test pilot before the war. Comfortable with taking personal risks, uncomfortable with public attention. In one interview from 1946, he said, "People act like we did something heroic. We didn't. We were just trying to get out of prison. The heroic thing would have been attempting the launch, succeeding or failing based on our skills and the quality of our work. Instead, we got rescued before we could try. That's not heroic. That's just anticlimactic." Goldfinch was more philosophical. In interviews later in life, he'd frame the glider as a symbol rather than a failure. "We proved that human ingenuity can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Whether the glider ever flew doesn't change that fundamental truth. We took a problem, being imprisoned in an escape-proof castle, and developed a solution that would have worked. The mathematics don't care that we never executed the plan. The engineering was sound. That's what matters."
The engineering community largely agreed with Goldfinch. When aviation engineers examined the plans and the remnants of the original glider, they were impressed by how sophisticated the design was given the circumstances. The wing structure was efficient, the control system was elegant, the launch mechanism was creative and functional. Several engineers published papers analyzing the Colditz Cock's design, using it as a case study in resource-constrained engineering. One paper, published in 1952 by a British aeronautical engineer who'd examined the original plans, concluded, "The Colditz Cock represents one of the finest examples of improvised engineering in military history. Working without proper tools, materials, or testing facilities, the designers created an aircraft that met all basic airworthiness standards. Had it been built under normal circumstances, it would have been considered a competent amateur design. That it was built in a POW camp makes it extraordinary." The 2000 Channel 4 documentary that built and flew the replica brought the story to a new generation. Young people who'd never heard of Colditz suddenly discovered this remarkable piece of history. The successful test flight proved definitively what had been speculation for 55 years. The glider would have worked. Best and Goldfinch's calculations were correct. The design was sound. The escape could have succeeded. The test pilot who flew the replica, John Lee, was interviewed immediately after landing. He was asked what it felt like to fly an aircraft designed by prisoners 60 years earlier. His response? "It flew beautifully. Stable, responsive, exactly what you'd want in a glider." These men weren't amateurs playing around. They were serious engineers who understood aerodynamics at a fundamental level. Flying their design was an honor. Bill Goldfinch watched that test flight from his wheelchair at age 84. Reporters surrounded him, asking for his reaction. He was silent for a long moment, watching the replica glider sitting in the field where it had landed. Then he said simply, "Jack should be here to see this. He always knew it would fly. Now everyone else knows too." Jack Best's absence from that moment of vindication was the only sadness in an otherwise triumphant day. He'd died 11 years earlier, still believing the glider would have worked, but never having proof. His family attended the test flight in his place. His son, who'd grown up hearing stories about the Colditz Cock, later said, "My father spent the rest of his life wondering what if. What if the war had lasted 2 more days? What if they'd gotten the chance to launch? Seeing that replica fly would have answered his questions. I'm grateful that happened, even though he wasn't there to see it."
The Colditz Cock's place in military history is secure, but peculiar. It's famous precisely because it never flew operationally. If Best and Goldfinch had launched on April 12, 1945, and the escape had succeeded, it would have been a spectacular story, but ultimately just another successful escape. If they'd launched and crashed, it would have been a tragic footnote. But because they were liberated before they could attempt it, the glider exists in historical memory as pure potential, an escape that would have worked, proven decades later, with no lives lost and no failure to mar its reputation. This perfect failure quality makes the story particularly resonant. Everyone can project their own interpretations onto it. It represents determination, ingenuity, hope, defiance, and human creativity overcoming oppression. It's inspirational without being tragic. It's technically impressive without being morbid. It's a war story that doesn't involve death. And in a conflict that killed 75 million people, stories without death are rare and precious. The prisoners who contributed to the project but didn't achieve the fame that Best and Goldfinch received had their own complex feelings about the glider's legacy. Some felt proud to have been part of something extraordinary. Others felt their contributions were forgotten, overshadowed by the focus on the two designers. A few resented that the glider got so much attention when other successful escapes from Colditz received less recognition. Tony Ralt, the theatrical designer who'd helped with the fabric covering, addressed this tension in a 1978 interview. History remembers names and faces, not anonymous contributors. Best and Goldfinch get remembered because they were the designers, the pilots, the visible leaders. The rest of us were support crew. That's fine. Every great achievement requires leaders and supporters. We knew our roles. We're not forgotten. We're just not famous. There's a difference. The escape committee members who'd approved the project and allocated resources to it also had perspectives that history largely ignored. These senior officers had to balance multiple escape attempts, distribute limited materials, and manage the morale and security of hundreds of prisoners. Their decision to support the glider project, despite its seemingly impossible nature, was itself a form of leadership that deserves recognition. One escape committee member, squadron leader Brian Patton, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "Approving the Cock was one of the easiest decisions we made. Yes, it seemed impossible, but so did every escape from Colditz. The glider at least had solid engineering behind it. We'd funded other attempts based on nothing more than determination and luck. Best and Goldfinch offered determination, luck, and mathematics. That combination was worth supporting."
The materials acquisition network that supplied the glider project was itself a remarkable achievement. Coordinating hundreds of small thefts, smuggling operations, and diversions required planning and discipline that matched the glider's construction. The prisoners who ran this network, tracking what materials were needed, identifying opportunities to acquire them, coordinating transfers through chains of accomplices, were executing a complex logistics operation under hostile surveillance. Consider what had to be stolen and smuggled without detection. 1,400 bed slats from 700 different beds, carried one or two at a time. Approximately 60 sleeping bags, removed gradually from storage areas. 200 feet of electrical wire, taken in 6-inch segments from various locations, nails and screws from maintenance supplies, tools from workshop areas, a cast-iron bathtub, bags of cement. The scale of this operation was staggering, and yet the Germans never detected the systematic theft happening under their noses. This speaks to organizational sophistication that rivaled some military operations. The prisoners at Colditz had developed parallel systems: intelligence gathering, material acquisition, construction, security, counterintelligence that functioned effectively despite operating in secrecy under constant threat of discovery. In some ways, the glider project was less impressive as an engineering achievement than as an organizational one. Getting 700 men to work toward a common goal,
maintaining discipline and security for 4 years, coordinating activities across multiple teams. That's the real miracle. The psychological resilience required to work on a project that might never succeed, that could be discovered at any moment, that offered no personal benefit to most participants. This aspect of the Colditz Cock story often gets overlooked. These men worked for years knowing they might never see results, that liberation or death might come before completion, that their efforts might be wasted. Yet they continued working night after night because the act of building was itself a form of resistance. Psychologists who've studied POW behavior note that prisoners who engage in meaningful activity, who have goals and projects, survive captivity better than those who passively wait for rescue. The Colditz Cock gave hundreds of prisoners purpose during years of confinement. Even men who never touched the glider, who only contributed a bed slat or kept watch, felt invested in the project. They had something to care about beyond survival. That psychological benefit may have been the glider's greatest contribution. The German guards and commandant who ran Colditz never fully understood this psychological dimension. They saw the glider, after its discovery, as an impressive engineering trick, but not as the psychological weapon it actually was. It had kept prisoner morale high, given them purpose, and maintained their sense of agency. In a very real sense, the glider had been defeating German security every day of its construction, not through physical escape, but through psychological resistance.
This realization came too late for the Germans to do anything about it, but it influenced post-war thinking about prisoner management. Modern POW conventions and military detention protocols emphasize the importance of monitoring prisoner morale and disrupting organized activities that might sustain resistance. The Colditz Cock became a case study. Allowing prisoners too much unsupervised time, too much organizational freedom, can lead to sophisticated resistance operations. The technical legacy of the Colditz Cock extends beyond its specific design. Aviation historians note that it represented one of the last fabric and wood gliders designed before the shift to all-metal aircraft construction. The techniques used, steam-bent wood forming, fabric doping with organic compounds, wire-braced structures, were becoming obsolete even as Best and Goldfinch employed them. In that sense, the glider was both cutting-edge in its improvised materials and anachronistic in its construction methods. Modern glider designers who've studied the plans note several areas where the design could have been improved with better materials. The wing loading was higher than optimal, meaning the glider needed more speed to stay aloft than a comparable design with lighter construction. The control system was functional but heavy, adding unnecessary weight. The launch mechanism, while creative, was potentially unreliable. The bathtub might have jammed, the cable might have snapped, the pulley might have seized. But these criticisms miss the point. Best and Goldfinch weren't trying to build the best possible glider. They were trying to build a glider that could be constructed in an attic using materials available in a POW camp. Given those constraints, their design was excellent. Perfect is the enemy of good enough, and the Colditz Cock was definitely good enough for its intended purpose. The question of whether the escape would have succeeded even if the launch had happened is unanswerable, but fascinating to consider. The flight itself would probably have worked. The 2000 test proved the glider could fly. But what about everything after landing? Best and Goldfinch would have touched down in German-controlled territory, miles from Allied lines, wearing their prison uniforms or improvised civilian clothes, speaking English with obvious British accents. They'd have needed to evade German military patrols, Hitler youth groups searching for downed airmen, civilian informers, and police checkpoints. They'd have needed food, civilian papers, local currency, and knowledge of which direction to travel. Some of this could be planned in advance, but much would depend on luck and improvisation. Many successful escapees from other camps were eventually recaptured during the evasion phase. Would Best and Goldfinch have been different?
Their chances were probably better than average. Both men had escaped and evaded capture before, at least temporarily. They were smart, resourceful, and determined. The fact that they'd built a glider demonstrated exceptional problem-solving abilities. These same skills would serve them during evasion. But evasion in April 1945 Germany, with the country collapsing and suspicious civilians everywhere, was extremely difficult. The odds were probably against them reaching Allied lines safely. Still, attempting the escape would have been worth it from their perspective. The alternative was remaining prisoners until liberation, which wasn't guaranteed. In the chaotic final weeks of the war, terrible things happened to POWs. Some camps were abandoned without food or supplies. Others saw prisoners massacred by SS units. Staying put and hoping for the best was its own form of risk. At least attempting the glider escape gave them agency, control over their own fate. The moral calculus of risking death for freedom is deeply personal. Some people would consider the risk unjustifiable. Why die attempting escape when liberation was potentially days away? Others would consider the attempt justified regardless of timing. Better to die free than live imprisoned. Best and Goldfinch clearly leaned toward the latter philosophy. They'd rather attempt the impossible than wait passively for rescue. This attitude was common among the incorrigibles at Colditz. These men had already attempted multiple escapes, already demonstrated they'd rather risk death than accept captivity meekly. The glider project perfectly suited their psychology: audacious, risky, defiant, and creative. For them, building and attempting to fly the Cock wasn't reckless. It was the most rational response to intolerable circumstances. The emotional aftermath of the glider never launching affected different participants differently. Some felt relief. They'd survived the war without having to risk the dangerous flight. Others felt profound disappointment. They'd worked for years on something they'd never see completed. A few felt anger at the timing, at fate, at the cosmic joke of being liberated before they could escape. There was no consensus about whether the outcome was fortunate or tragic. Best himself struggled with this ambiguity. In later years, he'd sometimes say he was glad they'd never had to attempt the launch, that they'd survived the war safely. Other times, he'd express regret that they'd never proven the concept in real combat conditions. His feelings apparently shifted depending on his mood and circumstances. There was no clean resolution to the emotional complexity of building something extraordinary that was never used. Goldfinch seemed more at peace with the outcome. His engineering mindset allowed him to appreciate the achievement independent of whether it was ultimately employed. He'd solved the problem. The solution was mathematically sound. The 2000 tests vindicated his work. For him, that was enough. The fact that historical circumstances prevented execution didn't diminish the quality of the solution.
This difference in perspective between Best, the pilot who wanted to fly the glider, and Goldfinch, the engineer who designed it, reflects a fundamental divide in how people process accomplishment. Some need to execute to feel fulfilled. Others can find satisfaction in creation itself, regardless of whether the creation is used. Neither perspective is wrong, they're just different approaches to meaning and purpose. The Colditz Cock's place in popular culture has evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, it was a feel-good story about Allied ingenuity. In the 1960s and 70s, it became a symbol of defiance against tyranny. In the 1990s and 2000s, it was rediscovered as an engineering achievement. Today, it's largely remembered as an inspirational story about human creativity overcoming impossible obstacles. Each generation finds different meaning in the story because the core narrative is rich enough to support multiple interpretations. You can focus on the engineering and see a story about technical problem-solving. You can focus on the human element and see a story about determination and hope. You can focus on the military aspect and see a story about POWs maintaining their duty to escape. The story works on multiple levels, which is why it's endured while many other World War II anecdotes have faded. The physical remnants of the original glider are scattered.
Some pieces were taken as souvenirs by liberating American soldiers. Others were supposedly kept by Colditz prisoners. A few may still exist in private collections or forgotten attics, but no complete original glider survives in any museum. The 2000 replica is now the primary physical representation of Best and Goldfinch's design, which creates an odd situation where a modern reconstruction is more accessible than the historical artifact it recreates. Colditz Castle itself is now a museum, and the attic where the glider was built is one of the main attractions. Visitors can climb the same ladder Best and Goldfinch used, see the space where they worked, and imagine the construction process. The false wall has been reconstructed to show how the glider was hidden. Photographs and diagrams explain the design. It's one of the most popular exhibits in the museum, drawing tens of thousands of visitors annually. Tour guides at Colditz report that visitors are most fascinated by the materials used, the bed slats, the porridge adhesive, the sleeping bag fabric. The fact that a functional aircraft was built from such mundane items resonates with people. It makes the achievement feel both more impressive and more relatable. Anyone can imagine having access to beds and porridge. Few people can imagine turning those materials into an airplane. The story's inspirational value has led to it being used in various educational contexts. Engineering schools use it as a case study in resource-constrained design. Business schools use it as an example of innovation under adversity. Military academies use it to teach about duty, persistence, and creative problem-solving. The Colditz Cock has become shorthand for achieving the impossible through determination and ingenuity.
But this inspirational framing sometimes glosses over the darker aspects of the story. These men were prisoners who'd spent years in captivity. They'd watched friends die, endured privation and abuse, lived with constant fear and uncertainty. The glider project was born from desperation as much as inspiration. Romanticizing their achievement risks minimizing their suffering. The full story is more complex and darker than motivational speeches usually acknowledge. Best and Goldfinch both pushed back against overly heroic narratives about their work. In interviews, they'd emphasize the mundane aspects of construction, the boredom, the tedious repetition, the small failures and adjustments. They didn't want to be portrayed as genius heroes. They saw themselves as ordinary men who'd gotten themselves into an extraordinary situation and tried to solve it using the skills they had. People think building the Cock was exciting, Goldfinch said in a 1985 interview. Most of it was boring. Sanding wood, stitching fabric, testing joints. The same tasks repeated hundreds of times until they were perfect. That's not exciting. That's just work. Necessary work, important work, but still just work. The exciting part, the flight, never happened. So what's left is just the memory of a lot of work that almost paid off. This unsentimental perspective is probably closer to the truth than the inspirational narratives. The Colditz Cock was built through persistence and routine, not through bursts of inspired genius. Best and Goldfinch succeeded because they showed up to the attic night after night, month after month, doing unglamorous work with no guarantee it would matter. That's the real lesson. Extraordinary achievements come from ordinary discipline applied consistently over time. The final irony of the Colditz Cock is that its fame came precisely because it never flew operationally. If it had launched and crashed, killing Best and Goldfinch, it would be remembered as a tragic mistake. If it had launched and succeeded, it would be one interesting escape among many. But because it existed in perfect potential, proven viable by the 2000 test, but never used in combat, it occupies a unique space, a success that was also a failure, a triumph that was also a disappointment, an achievement that exists primarily in imagination rather than historical fact. This liminal status, neither complete success nor total failure, is what makes the story so compelling. It's unfinished. It invites speculation. What if they'd launched 2 days earlier? What if the war had lasted 2 more days? What if they'd tried it despite being liberated? These unanswerable questions keep the story alive in ways that a cleanly concluded narrative couldn't.
Bill Goldfinch died in 2003 at age 87. His obituary in the Daily Telegraph led with "the Colditz Cock," describing him as the ingenious engineer who designed an escape glider that would have worked. It then mentioned his post-war career in aviation, his family, his other accomplishments. But the glider came first. After 82 years of life, he was defined by something he'd built over 4 years in his early 20s, something that never fulfilled its purpose. Did that bother him? Probably sometimes. But in his final interviews, Goldfinch seemed content with his legacy. "I gave 700 men hope during the darkest period of their lives," he said in 2001. The glider represented possibility. It reminded us that our captivity wasn't permanent, that we had agency, that we could still shape our own fate. Whether it ever flew, that doesn't change that psychological value. We built more than an aircraft. We built defiance. Jack Best's son, interviewed after the 2000 test flight, said something similar about his father's legacy. Dad spent his whole life asking, what if? What if the war had lasted longer? What if we'd launched? What if it worked? The test flight answered those questions. It did work. He was right. That vindication, even posthumously, matters. He can rest now. We know he built something real, not just a fantasy. The Colditz Cock sits now in the Colditz Castle Museum, the 2000 replica suspended from the ceiling of the attic where the original was built. Visitors look up at it, this elegant construction of wood and fabric, and marvel that it was built by prisoners using bed slats and porridge. The physics seem impossible, but the evidence hangs there, undeniable. Plaques explain the story. Photographs show Best and Goldfinch. Diagrams detail the construction. But what the museum can't capture is the emotional weight of those 4 years of work, the hope and determination that sustained 700 men through the darkest days of the war, the pride they felt in accomplishing something the Germans said was impossible, the disappointment when liberation came before launch, the vindication 55 years later when the design flew perfectly. You can't put those emotions in a museum case. You can only tell the story and hope people understand what it represented. That's what this narrative has tried to do, not just recount the technical details of how the Colditz Cock was built, but capture the human experience of building it, the desperation and determination, the tedium and triumph, the collective effort and individual genius. The story of the Colditz Cock is ultimately a story about refusing to accept impossible, about men who looked at walls and guards and said, "We'll go over," about solving problems that experts said couldn't be solved, about maintaining hope and purpose when everything suggested hopelessness, about building something beautiful and functional from scraps and determination.
Did Best and Goldfinch fail because they never flew? Or did they succeed because they proved it could be done? The answer is both. They succeeded in every way except execution. And sometimes proving something is possible is more important than actually doing it. They showed that prison walls, no matter how thick, can't contain human creativity, that determination and ingenuity can overcome almost any obstacle, that bed slats and porridge, in the right hands, can become wings. The Colditz Cock never flew during the war, but it's been flying through history for 80 years, inspiring new generations to look at their own impossible problems and think, maybe there's a solution. Maybe the experts are wrong. Maybe bed slats and porridge, or whatever scraps you have available, are enough if you're willing to work hard enough and think creatively enough.
That's the legacy. Not an escape that succeeded, but an idea that endures. Nothing is truly impossible if you refuse to accept it as such. The Nazis said Colditz was escape-proof. Best in Goldfinch built a glider in the attic and proved them wrong. They never got to fly it, but they didn't need to. Building it was enough. Proving it could fly was enough. Showing that the impossible was actually just the difficult wearing a scary mask, that was enough. The American lieutenant who discovered the glider in April 1945, climbing that ladder into the attic and finding a full-sized aircraft where no aircraft should exist, understood this immediately. He didn't see a failed escape attempt. He saw proof that human spirit can't be imprisoned, that creativity and determination will always find a way, that walls are just walls, and walls can be overcome. He stood in that dusty attic, running his hands over the fabric wings, examining the control cables, trying to process what he was seeing. And then he climbed back down and reported to his commanding officer, "Sir, you need to see this. I don't think anyone will believe it unless they see it themselves." Within hours, a parade of American officers, war correspondents, and liberated prisoners were climbing that ladder, staring in disbelief at what had been built literally over the Germans' heads. Some laughed, others shook their heads in amazement. A few just stood silently, overwhelmed by what it represented. One Polish prisoner, who'd been at Colditz since 1941 and had contributed bed slats from his bunk, was interviewed by an American correspondent that day. The journalist asked him what he thought about the glider never flying. The prisoner thought for a long moment, then said in broken English, "We did not need to fly. We needed to know we could fly. You understand difference? Is not same thing. Hope is not about success. Hope is about possibility. Glider gave us possibility. That was enough."
That distinction between succeeding and maintaining the possibility of success captures something essential about the human condition during extreme hardship. The prisoners at Colditz weren't naive. Most probably understood that the glider was a long shot, that even if launched successfully, the odds of reaching Allied lines were poor. But the existence of the glider, the fact that it was being built, meant that escape was still possible. And as long as escape was possible, they weren't truly prisoners. They were just men temporarily delayed on their way to freedom. This psychological reframe was crucial for maintaining sanity during years of captivity. Viktor Frankl, the psychologist who survived Auschwitz and later wrote about his experiences, emphasized that prisoners who maintained a sense of future purpose, who had something to work toward, survived better than those who lost hope. The Colditz Cock gave hundreds of men future purpose. Even those who would never fly it could work toward its completion, contributing their small part to something larger than themselves. The communal nature of the project was itself therapeutic. In a prison environment designed to isolate and demoralize, the glider created connections and shared purpose. A prisoner donating bed slats was connecting with the carpenters assembling the frame, who were connecting with the engineers calculating stress loads, who were connecting with Best and Goldfinch designing the whole system. 700 men, working together secretly, became a community bound by shared defiance. Modern organizational psychology recognizes this dynamic. Projects that give people agency, that allow them to contribute meaningfully to shared goals, increase satisfaction and resilience, even in adverse circumstances. The Colditz prisoners accidentally discovered what corporations now spend millions researching. Collective work toward audacious goals bonds teams and sustains morale better than any top-down motivation program. The German security apparatus at Colditz, despite its sophistication, never understood this psychological dimension. They saw the prisoners as a control problem, how to prevent physical escape.
They never grasped that psychological escape, maintaining the prisoner's sense of autonomy and resistance, was happening constantly through projects like the Cock. The Germans could control the prisoners' bodies, but not their minds. And ultimately, it was the mental resistance that mattered most. This lesson extended beyond Colditz. Throughout the POW camp system, prisoners who organized resistance activities, whether escape attempts, education programs, or covert sabotage, maintained better psychological health than those who passively accepted captivity. The act of resistance, regardless of whether it achieved tactical success, was itself a victory. It preserved the prisoner's sense of self, their identity as soldiers and free men, rather than just inmates.
The Colditz Cock was perhaps the purest expression of this principle. It achieved no tactical success, no one escaped using it, but it achieved enormous psychological success. It kept 700 men believing in possibility during years when everything suggested impossibility. That belief sustained them through whatever darkness they faced, whether starvation rations, brutal winters, physical punishment, or simply the soul-crushing tedium of captivity. Best and Goldfinch understood this, even if they couldn't articulate it during the war. In later interviews, they'd emphasize not the engineering achievement, but the human impact. "We gave men something to hope for," Goldfinch said in 1990. That was more important than whether the glider actually flew. Hope is a form of resistance. As long as men had hope, the Germans hadn't truly conquered them. This philosophy, that psychological resistance matters as much as physical resistance, influenced post-war military training. Modern SARE, survival, evasion, resistance, escape programs teach soldiers that maintaining mental autonomy during captivity is crucial for survival. Prisoners who can find ways to resist, even symbolically, even through small acts of defiance, maintain better psychological health than those who completely submit. The Colditz Cock became a case study in these training programs. Instructors would tell the story, emphasizing not the technical details, but the psychological strategy. The glider gave prisoners something to work toward, something to believe in, something that transformed them from passive victims into active agents. That transformation, that preservation of agency, was the real victory. Military ethicists have also studied the Colditz Cock from another angle: the allocation of resources to low-probability, high-payoff projects versus high-probability, low-payoff alternatives. The materials and time invested in the glider could have been used for more conventional escape attempts: tunnels, disguises, document forgery. These conventional methods had higher success rates but lower psychological impact. Was the investment in the glider strategically sound? The argument in favor says yes. The glider's psychological benefits, boosting morale, giving prisoners purpose, demonstrating that audacious thinking was valued, justified the resource allocation even if the tactical payoff never materialized. The argument against says no. If the goal was freeing prisoners, then resources should have gone to methods with higher success probability, regardless of psychological considerations. Both arguments have merit, which is why the debate continues in military education contexts. The Colditz Cock forces students to think about competing objectives: tactical success versus psychological resilience, probability versus impact, conventional wisdom versus innovative thinking. There are no clear right answers, which makes it excellent teaching material.
The story also raises questions about leadership and decision-making under uncertainty. The escape committee that approved the glider project did so without knowing whether it would succeed, whether it would be discovered, whether it would endanger other prisoners. They made a judgment call based on incomplete information and competing priorities. Was their decision sound? In retrospect, Knowing the glider was never launched and no one was endangered, we can say the decision worked out. But the committee couldn't know that outcome when they approved the project. They took a calculated risk based on their assessment of probabilities, consequences, and values. That's what leadership requires, making decisions without perfect information, accepting responsibility for outcomes, both good and bad. Best and Goldfinch also faced continuous leadership challenges during construction. They had to manage a team of volunteers, maintain security, allocate scarce resources, solve technical problems, and keep morale up during setbacks. They weren't just engineers, they were project managers, team leaders, and psychologists rolled into one. Their success in these leadership roles was as impressive as their engineering achievement. Consider the challenge of maintaining security among 700 accomplices for 4 years. One careless conversation, one drunken slip, one prisoner talking in his sleep. Any of these could have exposed the project. Best and Goldfinch couldn't control all 700 men directly. They had to create a culture of security consciousness where everyone understood the stakes and took personal responsibility for protecting the secret. They did this through a combination of trust, communication, and consequences. They trusted their fellow prisoners because they had no choice. Building the glider required collective participation. They communicated constantly about the importance of security, using stories about past escape attempts that failed due to security breaches. And they made clear that if the Germans discovered the glider, everyone would face punishment, not just the builders. This approach worked perfectly for 4 years. Not a single security breach occurred. No German guard ever suspected that a glider was being built in the attic. This is remarkable testament to the discipline and solidarity of the Colditz prisoner community. They kept the secret because they valued the collective goal more than individual safety or advancement. The contrast with other POW camps is instructive. Some camps suffered from factional conflicts, where different national groups or even different units within the same nationality wouldn't cooperate. Colditz had similar diversity: British, French, Dutch, Polish, and other prisoners from multiple services and units, but the shared experience of being incorrigibles created unity. Everyone at Colditz had attempted multiple escapes. Everyone had demonstrated they'd rather risk death than accept captivity meekly. This shared identity transcended national and unit boundaries. The glider project benefited from and reinforced this unity. Prisoners who might otherwise have remained in separate social circles were brought together by the project. A French artillery officer who donated wine bottles for the launch pulley system worked alongside a British engineer who calculated stress loads. A Polish pilot who advised on control surfaces collaborated with a Dutch carpenter who shaped the wing ribs. The glider became a physical manifestation of Allied cooperation, built by men from different nations working toward a common goal. This international cooperation extended to other aspects of camp life as well. Language barriers were overcome through patient teaching and creative communication. Cultural differences were respected but didn't prevent collaboration. The prisoners at Colditz created a functional international community based on shared values: duty to escape, defiance of captivity, and mutual support. In miniature, they modeled the kind of cooperation that the Allied powers were trying to achieve at the strategic level. The Germans, observing this cooperation but not understanding its depth, sometimes tried to exploit national differences. They'd offer better treatment to one national group, hoping to create jealousy or division. These tactics consistently failed at Colditz because the prisoners had built genuine solidarity through projects like the glider. They trusted each other in ways that propaganda and manipulation couldn't break. This trust was tested constantly. When one prisoner was caught attempting an escape, the Germans would interrogate him, trying to extract information about other escape attempts. The prisoner would endure punishment, solitary confinement, reduced rations, physical abuse, without revealing anything about the glider or other projects. This happened dozens of times during the glider's construction. Every prisoner who was caught and interrogated kept the secret. That's extraordinary discipline born from extraordinary trust. The post-war memoirs of Colditz prisoners consistently emphasize this trust and solidarity. They'd write about specific incidents, a near discovery averted, a security scare overcome, a temptation to talk resisted, and they'd credit their fellow prisoners' reliability. "I knew everyone would keep the secret because I'd have kept theirs," one memoir reads. "We'd all proven ourselves willing to suffer rather than betray each other. That's the foundation of genuine trust." This trust extended beyond the glider project. Prisoners would share food when rations were short, nurse each other through illness, provide emotional support during depression, and protect each other from abusive guards. The camp developed its own informal social support system that paralleled and often exceeded what the International Red Cross could provide. They became, in effect, a functional community that happened to exist inside a prison. The Germans recognized this community cohesion as a security problem, but never successfully disrupted it. They tried separating prisoners they believed were leaders. They tried rewarding informants. They tried increasing physical hardships, hoping desperation would break solidarity. Nothing worked. The prisoner community at Colditz was too strong, too unified by shared purpose and mutual respect. This resilience was built on small acts as much as large projects. Sharing a cigarette, teaching a phrase in another language, celebrating a birthday with improvised cake, listening when someone needed to talk. These mundane interactions created social bonds that sustained prisoners through years of hardship. The glider project added to these bonds by giving everyone a shared secret, a common cause that required ongoing cooperation and mutual trust. Modern research on community resilience confirms what the Colditz prisoners discovered intuitively. Communities that have strong internal bonds, shared purpose, and high trust survive adversity better than fragmented communities. The prisoners at Colditz weren't just surviving captivity, they were thriving relative to prisoners at other camps. Their escape attempt rate was higher, their morale was better, their post-war psychological outcomes were generally positive. The community they built sustained them. The irony, of course, is that the Germans inadvertently created this strong community by concentrating the most escape-minded prisoners in one place. If they'd kept incorrigible escapers dispersed across multiple camps, the prisoners wouldn't have formed such strong bonds or undertaken such ambitious projects. By putting them all together, the Germans enabled exactly the kind of organized resistance they were trying to prevent. This organizational mistake, concentrating your most determined opponents, has been studied by security professionals as a lesson in what not to do. Whether managing prisoners, dissidents, or any kind of opposition, segregating and concentrating the most committed members allows them to reinforce each other's determination and organize more effectively. The Colditz Cock was only possible because 700 determined escapers were housed together, sharing knowledge and supporting each other's efforts. Had Best and Goldfinch been kept in separate camps, they never would have met, never would have combined Best's piloting expertise with Goldfinch's engineering knowledge. Had the other prisoners been dispersed, the material acquisition network couldn't have functioned. Had the escape committee not existed, no one would have approved and supported the project. Every element necessary for the glider's construction was enabled by the Germans' decision to concentrate incorrigibles at Colditz.
This lesson, that concentrating resistance enables organization, has been applied to everything from prison management to counterterrorism strategy. You don't want your most committed opponents comparing notes and learning from each other.
You especially don't want them building community and mutual support. Yet that's exactly what the Germans allowed at Colditz, and the glider project was one consequence. The question of what would have happened had the glider launched successfully remains fascinating to consider. Best and Goldfinch had planned the flight itself carefully, but the evasion afterward was necessarily improvised. They'd have landed in fields approximately 200 meters from the castle, probably at night or in fog. German guards would have heard the launch. The bathtub crashing through the roof would have made tremendous noise. Pursuit would begin immediately. Best and Goldfinch's advantage would be surprise and darkness. The Germans would be confused about what happened, searching the castle interior before realizing prisoners had escaped externally. This would buy maybe 15–20 minutes before organized pursuit began. In that time, the escapers would need to hide the glider, change from prison clothes to civilian or military disguise, and begin moving away from Colditz. Their plan, such as it was, involved heading southwest toward the German-Swiss border approximately 100 kilometers away. They'd travel at night, hide during day, avoid roads and towns, live off the land or what little food they could scrounge. It was essentially the same evasion plan every escaper from Colditz used, adapted slightly for starting from a field rather than from inside the castle. The success rate for such evasions was poor. Maybe 20% reached neutral territory. Most were recaptured within a few days. But Best and Goldfinch had advantages. Both had evaded successfully before, at least for a while. Both spoke some German. Both understood navigation and could orient themselves using stars or landmarks. Their odds weren't good, but they weren't hopeless either. If they'd reached Switzerland and freedom, they'd have become legendary. 2 RAF officers who built a glider from bed slats flew it off a Nazi castle roof and walked to freedom through enemy territory. It would have been the escape story of the war, celebrated in every Allied newspaper, used for propaganda, maybe adapted into a film even before the war ended. Best and Goldfinch would have become household names. Instead, they became footnotes. The glider was discovered after liberation, made some news, and then faded from general awareness until the 2000 television project brought it back to public attention. They achieved immortality eventually, but the quiet kind reserved for historical curiosities rather than the instant fame they'd have gotten from a successful wartime escape. Did they prefer it this way? Probably. Neither man sought fame. Both were uncomfortable with the attention they did receive. If given a choice between successfully escaping and receiving massive recognition versus surviving the war quietly and remaining obscure, they likely would have chosen the former. But fate chose neither. They got liberation without escape, recognition without glory, fame without the accomplishment that would have made fame meaningful to them. This anticlimax, building something extraordinary that never fulfilled its purpose, has made some people dismiss the Colditz Cock as an interesting failure. But this misses the point entirely. The glider succeeded in every way except the final execution. It was brilliantly designed, expertly built, proven functional by later testing, and sustained prisoner morale for years. That it never launched doesn't diminish these successes, it just adds a layer of poignancy to the story. Consider the alternative narratives. If Best and Goldfinch had launched and crashed, dying in the attempt, the story would be tragic. Brave men who died attempting the impossible. If they'd launched and been recaptured, it would be a near miss. Admirable effort, unfortunate outcome. If they'd launched and succeeded, it would be triumphant, the ultimate escape. But because they were liberated before launching, the story exists in potential rather than actuality. It's simultaneously all of these outcomes and none of them. This quantum state, neither success nor failure until observed, makes the story philosophically interesting. What is achievement? Is it attempt or outcome? Process or result? The glider was built successfully. The escape was never attempted. So did Best and Goldfinch succeed or fail? The answer depends on how you define success. For Goldfinch the engineer, success was proving the design worked. The 2000 test provided that validation, even posthumously for Best. They succeeded. For Best the pilot, success required actually flying the mission, experiencing the launch, controlling the glider in flight, completing the escape. That never happened. They failed. Both perspectives are valid, which means the story resists simple categorization. This ambiguity is part of why the story endures. Clean narratives get processed and filed away. Ambiguous narratives keep generating discussion and reinterpretation. Every generation finds new meaning in the Colditz Cock because the story doesn't prescribe its own meaning. It presents facts: prisoners built a glider, war ended before launch, replica flew successfully, and lets people draw their own conclusions about what it means. For some, it's an inspirational story about attempting the impossible. For others, it's a cautionary tale about wasted effort on low-probability ventures. For still others, it's proof that process matters more than outcome, that the journey is more important than the destination. All of these interpretations are supported by the facts. None are definitively correct. The story contains multitudes. This interpretive flexibility has allowed the Colditz Cock to remain relevant across 8 decades. New contexts generate new meanings. During the Cold War, it was about resistance to tyranny. During the space age, it was about human ingenuity and technical achievement. During the computer age, it became about innovation and disruption. Today, in an era focused on resilience and mental health, it's about psychological survival and community support. The core story remains constant, but what people see in it evolves. Bill Goldfinch, living long enough to see multiple generations reinterpret his work, was amused by this. "People tell me what the glider means," he said in a late interview. "It means determination. It means innovation. It means hope." And I nod and say yes, probably, sure. But really, at the time, it meant we wanted to get out of that damned castle. Everything else is interpretation people apply afterward, which is fine. If the story helps people, they can interpret it however serves them. But let's be honest, we just wanted to escape. This pragmatic view that grand meanings are often applied retroactively to actions that were simply practical responses to immediate problems is characteristically British and characteristically Goldfinch. He built a glider because he wanted to escape, not to inspire future generations or prove philosophical points about human nature. The fact that his practical solution became laden with symbolic meaning over time was neither intended nor particularly important to him. But intent doesn't determine impact. The Colditz Cock inspired millions of people who never met Goldfinch or Best, who learned about the story decades after it happened, who drew motivation and meaning from it regardless of the builder's original intentions. Art and achievement take on lives independent of their creators. What Goldfinch meant to do matters less than what the glider came to represent. This is the final paradox of the Colditz Cock. A practical attempt at escape became an inspirational symbol. A functional aircraft became an art piece. And 2 engineers who just wanted to go home became unlikely heroes. They built something real that came to represent something abstract. They solved a tactical problem that came to embody universal human values. They failed to escape, but succeeded in escaping their own mortality, living on in a story that will outlast any individual life. And perhaps that's the ultimate measure of achievement, not whether you accomplish your immediate goal, but whether you create something meaningful enough that people remember and learn from it. Best and Goldfinch wanted to escape Colditz. They didn't. But they created something that escaped Colditz in a different way, soaring beyond those stone walls through time rather than space,
carrying their ingenuity and determination into generations they'd never meet.
The glider that never flew has flown further and longer than any aircraft that ever achieved takeoff. It's been flying through human imagination for 80 years, will continue flying for generations more, carrying the message that walls are temporary, but human creativity is eternal, that imprisonment is physical, but freedom is mental, that bed slats and porridge can become wings if you're willing to believe they can. That's the story of the Colditz Cock. Not a story about success or failure, but about what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept limits, when they support each other through darkness, when they maintain hope through years of hardship. It's about building something beautiful from scraps and determination. It's about proving that impossible is just a word used by people who've given up. Best and Goldfinch never gave up. 700 prisoners never gave up. They built an airplane in an attic using bed slats and porridge, and even though it never flew, it soared. Even though the escape never happened, they escaped. Even though the war ended before they could prove themselves, they proved something more important, that the human spirit cannot be imprisoned, cannot be broken, cannot be stopped by any wall or guard or circumstance. The Colditz Cock hangs in a museum now, a replica where the original once sat. Visitors look up at it, suspended from the ceiling, wings spread in permanent flight. They read the plaques, learn the story, marvel at the audacity and ingenuity. And sometimes, if they're paying attention, they learn the deeper lesson, that achievement isn't about outcomes, it's about attempt, that success isn't about completion, it's about commitment, that flying isn't about leaving the ground, it's about refusing to accept that you can't. Two men built a glider that almost changed history. It didn't change the war's outcome. That was decided by armies and industrial capacity and grand strategy. But it changed something perhaps more important. It proved that within every impossibility is the seed of possibility, waiting for someone stubborn enough, creative enough, determined enough to nurture it into reality. The Colditz Cock never flew during the war, but it's been flying ever since. Through history, through memory, through the dreams of everyone who's ever faced an impossible problem and thought, maybe there's a way. Maybe bed slats and porridge are enough. Maybe the experts are wrong. Maybe I can build wings and soar. That's the legacy. That's what endures. Not an escape that succeeded, but an idea that refuses to land. The idea that human ingenuity, determination, and community can overcome any obstacle. The idea that walls are just challenges waiting for creative solutions. The idea that freedom isn't a place you reach, it's a state of mind you maintain. Best and Goldfinch maintained that state of mind for 4 years in a Nazi prison. They built an airplane in an attic, proving that nothing is truly impossible if you refuse to accept it as such. They never got to fly it, but they didn't need to. Building it was flying. Believing it could work was freedom. And proving it to the world, even 55 years later, was victory enough. The glider that never flew has inspired more people than most aircraft that did. That's the measure of its success. That's the meaning of its existence. That's why 80 years later, people still tell the story of the Colditz Cock, the glider built from impossible hope, engineered with determination, and launched into history even though it never left the ground. It flew, just not the way anyone expected, and it's still flying now.